China is very, very much dependent on the input of raw material and oil. It has very little resource of its own, and this enormous economy and a population which is very demanding. And so we can try to frustrate that, and then we will get to, in that way, to blows. Or we can say, well, that's exactly what we're inviting all nations to do. Go participate in the global economy. You export what you can, you buy what you can, as long as you do it in a peaceful manner, and you have a fair trade. What I really want to emphasize on the previous point, before we lose sight of that, is China has to attend to its people. I start talking about North Korea, a country which is so tyrannical, it can disregard its population and invest in the military. The Chinese elites have long decided that they're not going to fall into that trap, that their political stability is no longer based on facing communism and that kind of ideology. Their political stability is based on bringing a high standard of living to more and more people, half of whom don't even have running water or use an outhouse as their toilet. So they cannot, in terms of their own interest, their inner political stability, shift these resources to military use.
I'm going to pause a moment for station identification, particularly for the benefit of our many listeners on the Sirius XM channel 124, the POTUS channel, who hear this program on every Saturday at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, and 9:30 p.m. Eastern. This program can also be heard and seen around the world on the stations of the Voice of America and on 200 American television stations, public and public access, the so-called PEG stations, educational, political, and public access. We're so glad you're with us. I'm Llewellyn King, and I'm talking today with Professor Amitai Etzioni of the George Washington University, one of our most distinguished sociologists. Our subject is how we are reacting to the growth and expansion of China, we here in the United States, and whether we are developing a Chinese phobia or not. Professor, continue. We've just said, that China is behaving well in some ways, although we were told China would behave perfectly if it entered the World Trade Organization, and it hasn't behaved perfectly. It's been a naughty child.
Well, let's those who behave perfectly cast the first stone. Unfortunately, when we come to international relations, there are very few saints. We used to have a quota on importation of steel, on cars, on textile. We subsidized. President Obama recently called on American corporations to bring jobs back home, and we can go on and on. We have an export-import bank which tries to subsidize our export. There are very few saints in the international trade business. And WTO is really the place where, again, these issues are brought forward by China and by the United States, and so far have been all resolved peacefully. Let me go back. You see, the political scientists like to distinguish between capabilities, like the size of the economy, and intentions. And there's an interesting point on the intention issue. China looked at the Soviet Union, and what, for obvious reasons, after all, they had a similar political history. And what they saw is that we, the United States, succeeded in driving them into bankruptcy. President Reagan, one of the many things he did, he accelerated the arms race because he knew that Russia's economy, which was much weaker, couldn't keep up and will end up broken. And that's exactly what happened. Is one of the many reasons the communist regime collapsed. China, whose economy is still much, much smaller per capita than ours, looked at the experience of the Soviet Union and decided they're not going to fall into the trap. They will not allow us to force them into an arms race and end up by bankrupting their economy.
Amitai, over the last several decades, we have seen various concerns in this country. The Russians were coming. They went away.
Japanese.
The Japanese were coming in the 1990s. They got a hernia, an economic hernia. The Germans, well, the Germans are still there, but we look rather kindly on them, and their economy is doing fairly well. Then the tiny city-state of Singapore was held up as the invincible. Now we have a very large country where, at a time when our rate of growth is about 2%, 2.5, if we're lucky, something like that, and theirs is 10%. Now that's a doubling every 7 years in their case, right? I mean, the math are very simple. They're going to overhaul us if that trajectory continues.
I like that. I like that. If it continues, it's already not continuing. I mean, God should protect us from straight line projections. From this,
I would agree with that. Straight line projections are the worst. I knew a man once who said the trouble with the 20th century was graph paper. You could draw these lines out to infinity. Keep going.
No, exactly. So they are already slowing down very much so. I think we're much closer to 7% than to 10%. It's still substantial, but I would predict, and I'd be happy to be judged by that prediction, that they're going to slow even more. But more important, they face enormous environmental and demographic challenges. Jim Fellow just wrote a book about China, who lived the last 4 years.
Which he knows it quite well, yes.
He said that life expectancy in Beijing is 5 years shorter than in other places because the pollution is so bad. He himself and everybody he knows had various upper respiratory illnesses. I know you've been to Beijing, I've been to Beijing. It's very difficult to spend there more than a few days before you start coughing. Now, this is just the kind of the symbol of a much, much deeper issue. And they just cannot physiologically continue like this, and they'll have to shift resources to attend to environmental challenges. They are aging very rapidly. As a result of this one-child policy, they have a very skewed demographic. They will have, we are also aging, Japan is also aging, but because of immigration, especially of Latinos, basically stay relatively young, while they are rapidly aging. So combined effect of the environmental challenges, the demographic challenges, and they need to distribute wealth much more widely. And you see that this notion that the economy will grow and grow and grow is simply an erroneous projection on the future. Most important, we have time. People talk about China hedge. And what they mean by that is that even if we don't know what's going to happen 20 years from now, we should start now building warships and warplanes and fighters because maybe we'll have to fight them 20 years from now. Nobody argues that they pose a military challenge in the near future, but they think we have to start now building up. I argue the other way around. There's time to what Henry Kissinger called for Zbigniew Brzezinski called for trying to work with them as partners in the world order rather than turning them prematurely into enemies and adversaries.
Going back to your skills as a sociologist, how many phobias can a country deal with at one time? If we're developing a phobia about China, we've got a pretty established, robust phobia about Islam. Can we have a duality of hatred, if you will, or dislike?
I think actually that's in many ways one of the reasons I'm here. Our immediate threats in the next 2-3 years clearly lie in the Middle East. The Al-Qaeda, which we kind of defeated in Afghanistan, is succeeding in Yemen and in Somalia, despite the fact we took some people out recently. The situation in Pakistan is extremely serious. They're accelerating their nuclear military program in response to India, and their nuclear weapons are not secure. There have been several instances in which Al-Qaeda or Taliban already broke into the bases in which they hold their nuclear weapons. So our immediate concerns, I don't know anybody in the security business who does not agree that nothing threatens us more than a combination of a nuclear weapon and a terrorist. So our immediate challenges lie in the Middle East. And at this point, to shift our limited capacity, ours is limited, to the Far East It's just a premature pivoting.
But China is shifting out of the Far East. It is essentially bought its way into 48 countries in Africa and most of the countries of Latin America by buying up the raw materials, establishing Chinatowns, buying off the governing people. The thing that astounds me is not that they've done this, but they had the skilled people to do it without any colonial experience. And yet, you know, to be in 48 African countries, or 46, they may have been pushed out of 2 since I last looked, that is a major achievement. It far exceeds anything the British Empire, the French Empire, the Belgians, or the Dutch succeeded in terms of imperial penetration of third world countries.
Oh my God, you start throwing those words around, imperial and such, colonial.
No, they're well-chosen words, and I use them advisedly.
Of course, you're extremely good at this, and I think it's a fair challenge you pose. Only the difference is that the empires conquered and occupied those countries. The colonial meant taking over and governing those countries. The Chinese are doing nothing of the sort.
But you see, the colonials couldn't buy those countries. There was nothing to buy. Now there is something to buy, and the Chinese have bought it. It's very interesting, but it means that they're no longer contained in China. They're global already.
They're global in the best sense of the term. It's exactly what we want people to do. We want them to invest in other countries, buy their products, and sell stuff to them. That's our image of the good world. That's what we are doing with the French, the German, and everybody else supposed to be doing. They're trading peacefully in investing. But the best news is that a drive of theirs is extremely self-correcting. And so not only did Vietnam and Philippines and Angola and such move away from China, even Burma, they're one of their closest allies, just canceled a major deal.
There are always these shifts. I mean, look at Egypt, or the countries that have been in and out of influencing Egypt or occupying Egypt. But it is a case when one is defending China to recognize that China has agendas that we have never seen before. And I'm afraid that's the end of our discussion for today, but we have another session coming up in a short while, a few weeks, and we will continue with this talk. Professor, it's an honor to have you on the broadcast.
Thanks for having me. Let's continue.
Absolutely. Goes quickly, doesn't it? Good stuff. Good stuff.